Welcome to this video tutorial where you will learn to be an active bystander and address gender-based violence on your campus. The next time you're in class, think about these numbers. 1 in 3 women around the world experience violence, and 1 in 5 men experience violence. 1 in 2 female students on NTC campuses have experienced sexual harassment, and 1 in 3 female students have experienced sexual violence. The statistics are overwhelming, but the silver lining is we have a very powerful resource to fight it. You, as a bystander, have an important role to play to prevent violence and support those experiencing it. Through this video, you will learn how to transition from a passive observer to an active bystander. Let's start by reviewing the terminology. Sexual and gender-based violence is an umbrella term used to describe different forms of violence, such as sexual abuse, domestic violence, child marriages, female genital mutilation, and honor crimes. While women and girls are disproportionately affected, it's important to remember that men also experience violence. Violence can be differentiated based on the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. When the perpetrator is a romantic partner or a family member, it is called domestic or interpartner violence. Non-partner violence is perpetrated by people who don't share a family or romantic relationship with the victim. This type of violence commonly occurs on college campuses, and it is the main focus of our video. So what does violence look like? The most common form of violence is physical violence, which refers to intentionally using physical force to cause harm or injury. This includes slapping, hitting, using weapons, or threatening to use weapons. Sexual violence describes sexual contact without consent. Consent is very easy to understand. In fact, it's as easy as eating fries. The fries model teaches us that consent should be freely given without any external pressure, manipulation, or the influence of drugs. Reversible, giving consent doesn't mean you can't change your mind later. At any point, you have the right to say stop. Informed, you can only consent to something if you have the full story. For example, if someone says they'll use a condom and then they don't, there isn't full consent. Enthusiastic, consent should be freely given and without reserves. If you feel reluctant or pressured, this is not enthusiastic. Specific, giving consent to one thing doesn't mean you have consented to others. For example, if you say yes to visiting your partner or kissing them, it doesn't mean you have said yes to engaging in sex. When consent is not given, it is considered abuse. This can include rape and also unwanted touching, threats of sexual violence, verbal sexual harassment, or forcing someone to look at explicit images or text. Emotional violence involves exerting control through fear and manipulation. This includes verbal abuse and restricting the victim's social support. Economic violence refers to control through financial means. This can include withholding access to money or restricting access to important resources like education and employment. While these forms of violence are inflicted at an interpersonal level, there is a larger structural framework that allows violence to occur. This is driven by inequalities in our social, political, and economic context. At the social level, gender norms create stereotypes of how men and women should behave. Cultural messages like boys will be boys or act like a lady affects how we respond to violence. The pressure on women to control their behavior creates a culture of victim blaming, where girls are held responsible for experiencing violence. On the other hand, bad behavior is normalized. removing the responsibility from men. At a political level, laws and policies create a system where victims have difficulty accessing help and justice. For example, if your university has no clear policies to address sexual harassment, it creates a barrier for victims. At an economic level, if men and women don't have equal access to education, healthcare, and employment, it creates a difference in power. This forms an environment where some people have less power, are more vulnerable to violence, and can be manipulated. Now that we've understood what violence looks like, let's think about it in the context of our NTC campuses. Have you come across violence on campus? What type of violence do you think is the most common? In 2019, a study was conducted across 5 Ugandan national teacher colleges to understand gender-based violence on campus. 720 students and 152 staff were interviewed. When asked about their feelings of safety, 23% of students felt unsafe going to the washroom, and 11% felt unsafe going to their dormitories. 4% of male students and 12% of female students felt unsafe on campus. Both students and staff experienced non-partner violence on campus in the last 12 months. Half of the staff members had experienced violence, while more than 70% of students experienced violence. Psychological violence was the most common, with almost 60% of students and 45% of staff affected. This was followed by sexual harassment, which affected 41% of students and 22% of staff. 34% of students and 18% of staff reported physical violence, while 21% of students and 10% of staff experienced sexual violence. Male and female students had similar levels of physical and psychological violence, but there was a vast difference in sexual harassment. Almost half of female students experienced sexual harassment compared to 33% of male students. Female students also had higher levels of sexual violence compared to their male peers. Let's look at some examples based on real-life cases from Ugandan universities. A group of boys in your class ask comments about their female classmates. They often remark on the girls' clothing or bodies and make sexually provocative jokes. The girls look clearly uncomfortable and embarrassed, but nobody says anything. This is an example of sexual harassment and is a form of sexual violence. Sheila is a student from a low-income family background. She has received a scholarship to attend college, but recently she gets low marks in one of her classes. The lecturer has propositioned her to provide him with sexual favors in exchange for better marks. He forces her to stay after class and is now threatening to fail her. This is an example of sexual violence. Vincent and Eliza are in a relationship. Recently, Vincent is very withdrawn and does not hang out with his friends. He tells you that Eliza does not let him meet his friends and monitors his phone to prevent him from talking to them. She often insults him. This is an example of emotional violence. Matthew is a first-year student. He often gets teased for being weak and is called a sissy. Some of his classmates bully him. One day, his classmates hit him during football practice. He tries to defend himself, but they surround and threaten him. This is an example of physical violence. Charlotte is a third-year student who recently discovered she is pregnant. She is unmarried and very afraid to tell her family. When her professors find out, they ask her to leave the university housing and to stop her classes. Charlotte is helpless and scared. This is an example of structural violence. So how do we fight against this problem? This is where you come in. you as a bystander have an important role to prevent violence. Studies have shown that if a bystander responds when violence is occurring, in 50% of cases the incident stops or de-escalates. By speaking up, you can also reduce the trauma for the person who was harmed and rewrite the normalization of violence in our society. So what is a bystander? Every person who encounters or observes an act of violence is a bystander. While the word bystander sounds very passive, a bystander can actually be an active agent of change by stepping in to intervene in cases of violence. This has two effects. It prevents violence as it occurs, and it also changes societal norms to be more aware and critical of violence. However, many bystanders don't respond when they encounter violence. Why do you think this is? Think back to a time you observed a violent incident. How did you respond? Did you experience doubts that held you back? Most bystanders are not sure if they should intervene. They don't know if what they are observing is indeed violence or a harmless joke. Even when they are sure, they often feel incompetent, they don't know how to react, or believe someone else will take action. Some bystanders may hesitate because they are worried that the perpetrator would harm them. These are all valid considerations, but it often leads to the bystander effect, where people are less likely to help victims if there are other people present. However, it's very important to find ways around this issue, because when bystanders step in, it does make a difference. This training will help you overcome these barriers. It will teach you different methods to respond and show you when to use them. Let's look at what you can do as an active bystander. The first step is being aware of violence on your campus. Most people are unaware of their surroundings and they don't know what's going on around them. It's important to be observant. Some cases of violence are easily recognizable, such as physical violence, but there are others that are less obvious. This can include a person passing offensive or sexual comments, controlling behavior patterns, or signs of abuse in a relationship. These situations are indicative of violence that is occurring below the surface, or can be a sign of high risk to escalate to violence. Red flags that someone is experiencing violence are emotional distress, being isolated from friends, or a sudden change in behavior, like being more withdrawn or engaging in risky behavior. It's important for you to be aware and pay attention for these signs of violence. You can use the information in this video, but also remember that sometimes your intuition can be the best clue to detecting a problem. Once you are aware of a violent incident, you have to decide how to address it. Here you have a useful tool, the 5Ds model of bystander intervention. This model has been designed to help bystanders formulate their response to violence. Direct. Often the best course of action is to directly intervene and speak up. It's important to first assess your safety, to be sure that you will not be harmed. When directly intervening, it's important to be firm and clear. Let's review how to use this approach in the case where a group of boys are sexually harassing their classmates. You can step in and say, "Excuse me, I overheard your remarks. That is very inappropriate and it makes us all feel uncomfortable." You can also check in with the people who are facing harassment and offer them your support. Delay. Sometimes it's not possible to directly intervene. Perhaps the harassment happened very quickly or you are afraid. In these cases, you can delay your intervention to a suitable moment after the violent incident. You can ask the person affected by violence if they are okay and offer your support. In the previous example of sexual harassment, You may use this strategy if you are afraid to directly confront the harassers. You can approach the girl experiencing violence and let her know that you saw what happened and it is not okay. Ask how you can support her, either by accompanying her to her destination or by helping her report the incident. Distract. Another indirect approach is to distract attention away from the violent person and de-escalate the situation. This is a subtle and creative method to interrupt the violence and give the victim the opportunity to get away. The key to being effective is to not talk about the violence but refer to something unrelated. For example, let's consider the situation where Matthew was being physically threatened and abused by his classmates. You can walk up to them and create a distraction. You could pretend to be lost and ask for directions, or talk to them about something random to change their focus. Delegate. When you're planning your intervention, you may need support from others. Look around for someone who can help you and delegate responsibilities to work together. When delegating, be clear and specific. Document. You can document the situation through video recordings, pictures, or by noting down details. This can help the person being harmed to file a complaint and seek justice. Keep in mind the keys to safe and responsible documenting. First, be sure someone else is already helping to de-escalate the violence. If not, documenting without helping can just add to the trauma. Secondly, remember that your documentation should be focused on the person being harmed. Give them the documentation and ask them what they would like to do with it. Never post it online or use it without their consent. Let's apply this approach to Matthew's case. If there is someone intervening to support Matthew, you can use your phone to make a video recording of the incident. Be sure to state the date and the time of the incident, and make sure your video captures identifying details of the location and people involved. Keep a safe distance. After the incident, approach Matthew and offer him the recording. Let him know that he can use it as evidence to report the incident. Whichever approach you decide to use, remember that your actions can be impactful. As a bystander, you hold the power to make a difference on your campus.